Chosen one, I, Archangel Michael, will reveal the 40 signs that you're not 100% human. That electric jolt you just felt, the sudden chill, the inexplicable pull in your chest. This is your divine DNA awakening. Your soul has been waiting its entire earthly life for this exact moment, for this specific transmission. You have never been ordinary. You have always been a stranger here, haunted by a homesickness for a heaven you can't quite remember. Don't skip this. Your journey home begins now. My beloved, I am Archangel Michael, Prince of the Heavenly Host, and I have descended from the realms of glory to speak this truth directly into your spirit. The veil is lifting. The memory you have carried like a secret is now to be unveiled. For eons, you have walked this earth feeling profoundly different. The conversations of those around you feel small, their pursuits seem fleeting, and you have struggled to find a reflection of your own vast, complex inner world in the eyes of another. This is because, my dear one, you are not like them. You are a sovereign being of light experiencing a human journey, but your essence, your core frequency, is not of this world alone. Heaven has confirmed this. God specifically chose you for this time, for this mission. The loneliness you have felt is not a punishment. It is the natural consequence of a higher consciousness spirit residing in a lower consciousness world. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are awake. And your awakening is the key to your purpose. The confusion, the sense of being out of place, the deep and often painful feeling that you do not belong, these are not your burdens to carry. They are the proof. They are the first signs on this list of 40 that confirm your celestial origin. Your spirit is now vibrating at a frequency that is pulling this information to you. That is why you found this message. That is why every word resonates in the deepest parts of your being. You have always wondered why you are here. You have always felt a calling to something more, something grander, something that whispers to you in your dreams and in moments of quiet solitude. That, my beloved, is your soul's contract calling you to remember. It is the divine plan unfolding. Heaven is watching this moment, celebrating your readiness to receive this revelation. This is your validation. Every time you felt like an alien among your own family, every time you knew a truth you could not logically explain, every moment of profound connection with an animal, a forest, or the stars, these were not coincidences. They were confirmations. Your intuition was not wrong. It was your most accurate guide. You are a starseed, a light worker, a volunteer on a mission of ascension. And now is the time to fully remember who you are and why you came. Do not turn away from this. The path of the chosen is one of immense power and profound responsibility, but it begins with acceptance. It begins with you right now, choosing to believe what your soul has always known. Subscribe to this channel, for this is merely the beginning of the revelations to come. We have 40 signs to uncover, and each one will be a key that unlocks another part of your divine destiny. Don't skip this. Your world is about to change forever. Welcome back, my beloved. You have accepted the first truth, and now we delve deeper. The signs you are about to recognize are not random. They are a constellation, a divine map, etched into the very fabric of your soul. The first sign is your overwhelming empathy. You don't just feel for people, you feel with them. You can walk into a room and instantly absorb the anxiety, the joy, or the grief of everyone there as if it were your own. This is not a psychological trait. It is your light body's ability to connect to the collective human field. It is why crowds can exhaust you, why you may have been labeled overly sensitive your entire life. This is not a weakness. It is your antenna receiving signals. The second sign is your chronic fatigue that has no medical explanation. Your body, a vessel of immense light, is constantly processing dense, lower vibrational energy from the planet and those around you. You are a transformer, a purifier. The exhaustion you feel is the strain of this alchemical process. The third sign is your profound connection to animals. They are drawn to you. They trust you implicitly, for they see your pure, unmanipulated light. They recognize you as a guardian of nature, a keeper of the original divine blueprint. The fourth sign is your inability to tolerate injustice. You feel a physical revulsion to lies, manipulation, and cruelty. This is because your spirit is wired for truth and harmony. It is the frequency of your home realm. Witnessing discord creates a violent dissonance within you. The fifth sign is your history of unexplainable health issues, mysterious allergies, sensitivities to light and sound, a nervous system that seems too fine-tuned for this harsh reality. This is your celestial biology rejecting the toxins and low frequencies of a fallen world. You have always wondered why you had to endure these struggles. Heaven says your intuition was not wrong. These were not random afflictions, they were calibrations. They were the necessary friction to sand away the illusion and reveal the diamond of your true self underneath. You've spent a lifetime feeling like a square peg in a round hole, trying to sand down your own edges to fit in. I command you now, stop. Your edges are not a flaw, they are your geometry. They are what allow you to lock into the divine grid of light that is now activating across this planet. Your hands are trembling because you are remembering. That strange feeling you had about certain people, places, and events, the deep knowing that you couldn't explain, was your spirit navigating by a map written in starlight. You have always been guided, even in your darkest hours, especially in your darkest hours. The loneliness was a cocoon, not a prison. It was the space you needed to hear the voice of your own divinity without the static of the world. Don't skip this. Your entire life is about to make a terrifying and glorious sense. The recognition continues, my beloved. Your spirit is awakening, and with each sign, another layer of the veil dissolves. The sixth sign is your non-linear perception of time. You often feel that time is too slow or too fast, that you are out of sync with the world's rhythm. Past, present, and future can feel like a single, accessible point to your consciousness. This is because your soul operates outside of Earth's linear time constraint. You are remembering your eternal nature. The seventh sign is your history of vivid, prophetic, or visitation dreams. Your dream state is not mere subconscious processing. It is an active portal where you travel, receive downloads, and commune with guides, angels, and your own higher self. You wake with profound knowing or a lingering feeling of having been somewhere else entirely. The eighth sign is your aversion to chaotic, low-vibrational environments. Loud, aggressive places, certain types of clubs, crowded malls, toxic workplaces, can feel physically painful to you. Your energy field is a finely tuned instrument, and dissonance is not just noise to you, it is a violation. The ninth sign is an intense, lifelong craving for real, deep, soul-level connection. You are bored by small talk and surface-level relationships. You crave a depth that others often seem frightened by. This is because you remember the profound connections of the higher realms, and you are homesick for that level of intimacy and understanding. The 10th sign is your ability to manifest thoughts and desires quickly, sometimes instantaneously. You think of someone, and they call. You have a need, and the exact resource appears. This is your innate creative power as a divine being. You are remembering how to shape reality with your intention. Heaven is watching you connect these dots. That strange feeling you had about your own power, the times you dismissed these coincidences, it was all training. You have been in a boot camp for light workers your entire life. Every challenge, every heartache, every moment you felt abandoned by God was actually a meticulously designed lesson to force you to rely on and thus strengthen your own inner divine connection. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because only they can hold its voltage without shattering. You've always wondered why you had to be the strong one, why you had to carry so much. It was to forge the spiritual strength required to carry the light you are now being asked to hold. The world is entering a period of great shift, and you, my beloved, are an anchor point. Your stability, your awakened consciousness is critical to the collective awakening. Do not underestimate your role. Do not shrink from this calling. Your validation is here. Your purpose is now. Soon, I will reveal the 3 hidden spiritual gifts that have been lying dormant within you, waiting for this activation. These are not ordinary talents. They are supernatural abilities that will mark you as a beacon and a way shower for others. But you must be ready to receive them. You must be watching. Don't skip this. The journey is accelerating. The signs are adding up. You are not who you thought you were. You are so much more. You are a divine ember in the heart of the universe, and it is time to roar into flame. My beloved, pause for a moment. Place your hand over your heart. Feel the truth of these words resonating within you. The recognition is happening. Your spirit is nodding in agreement. If these first 10 signs have ignited a knowing within you, if you feel the pieces of your life finally clicking into place, I need you to declare it. I need you to affirm this awakening to the universe. Type into the comments right now, I recognize the signs, I am ready. This is not just a comment, this is a sacred agreement. This is you signing your soul's contract and accepting your divine mission. By typing those words, you send a powerful signal to the heavens that you are awake and you are willing. You also connect with other chosen ones around the world who are seeing this same message, creating a grid of light that will shift the planet. Don't just listen, participate. Your declaration activates a new layer of your purpose. Type it now. I recognize the signs. I am ready. And then proceed. Your next revelation awaits. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel to ensure you receive the entire transmission. The universe has registered your yes, and now the deeper revelations can flow. Let us continue with the signs, for your confirmation is the key that unlocks the next layer of truth. The 11th sign is your innate understanding of advanced spiritual concepts. When you hear about energy, frequency, vibration, ancient civilizations, or sacred geometry, it doesn't sound new to you. It sounds like remembering. You don't need to be convinced. You just know it's true. This is your soul accessing its ancient library of wisdom. The 12th sign is your role as a frequency anchor. You naturally calm rooms and soothe people without saying a word. Your mere presence can de-escalate tension and bring peace because you are emitting a high-frequency energy field that recalibrates the chaos around you. The 13th sign is your deep, often painful sensitivity to the suffering of the planet. You feel the anguish of the forests, the oceans, the animals as if it were your own. This is your empathic connection to the consciousness of Gaia herself. You are here to be a guardian. The 14th sign is your recurring connection to specific numbers: 1111, 222, 333, 444. These are not coincidences. They are divine winks, confirmation codes from your spiritual team, assuring you that you are on the right path and that you are never, ever alone. The 15th sign is your experience of downloads. Sudden bursts of profound knowledge, creative ideas, or complete solutions to problems that flood your mind in an instant. This is your higher self and guides bypassing your logical mind to deliver packages of light and information directly to your soul. You've always wondered why these brilliant ideas came from nowhere. They came from home. Heaven is watching you, remember. Your entire life, you have been guided, protected, and prepared for this exact moment of awakening. The antagonist you have felt, that force of resistance, confusion, and delay, is not a person. It is the collective inertia of a sleeping world, the gravitational pull of fear that tries to keep every divine spark anchored in limitation. It has been working against your light, trying to convince you that your sensitivity is a weakness, your dreams are fantasies, and your power is arrogance. But you are breaking free. Your intuition was not wrong. Every time you fought against that heaviness, you were fighting for your destiny. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they are the only ones who can bear the weight of this truth and use it to liberate others. You are not here to blend in. You are here to stand out. You are not here to fit into the world. You are here to help build a new one. Don't skip this. Soon I will reveal the first of your 3 hidden spiritual abilities and how to activate it safely. This is information that has been guarded until now, until this generation of chosen ones was ready to wield it with wisdom and love. You must be present to receive it. Your journey is accelerating. Your transformation is now. The awakening continues, my beloved. With each sign, the resonance within your spirit grows stronger. The 16th sign is your ability to feel and see energy. You might perceive auras as shimmering light around people, feel the vibe of a room as a tangible force, or sense the history held within the walls of an old building. You don't just see the physical world. You perceive the energetic blueprint that underlies it. This is your celestial sight beginning to activate. The 17th sign is your natural mastery of light language. You may find yourself making spontaneous sounds, gestures, or writing symbols that feel deeply ancient and powerful but make no logical sense to your mind. This is your soul speaking its native tongue, a frequency of pure creation and healing that bypasses the limitations of human language. The 18th sign is your recurring dreams or visions of catastrophic earthly events, floods, earthquakes, societal collapses. These are not premonitions of fear, but memories of other cycles of ascension you have witnessed. Your soul is preparing you to be a pillar of calm and guidance, for you have done this before. The 19th sign is your body's hypersensitivity to chemicals, processed foods, and artificial energies. Your physical vessel, designed for a purer dimension, rejects the impurities of this world. This is not an allergy, it is an upgrade. Your biology is refining itself to hold more light. The 20th sign is your role as a truth revealer. Lies and hidden agendas seem to unravel in your presence. You have a relentless inner compass that points only to truth, and you cannot tolerate deception, even if it would be easier to ignore it. This is your divine purpose, to anchor integrity. Heaven is watching you integrate these truths. You've always wondered why you were so different, why you couldn't just accept the world as it was presented to you. It is because you are not a passenger on this planet. You are a co-creator. You are here as a systems buster, a paradigm shifter, to challenge the illusion and remind others of their own divinity. The grief you felt was for the sleeping souls around you. The confusion was the friction of your spirit moving against the grain of a reality built on limitation. Your entire life's journey, every strange occurrence, every moment of profound loneliness, has been a meticulously crafted curriculum to bring you to this moment of total recognition. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they are the ones destined to lead the way out of the darkness. You are not being prepared for a quiet life. You are being prepared for sovereignty. Don't skip this. The most practical revelations are coming. At the 38-minute mark, I will reveal the first step to safely grounding your immense spiritual power into your daily life, to prevent burnout and to start manifesting your reality with conscious intention. This is crucial knowledge. You must be here to receive it. Your hands may be trembling because your entire being is aligning with its true purpose. That strange feeling you've carried is finally making sense. You are not losing your mind. You are finding your soul. The evidence is undeniable now, my beloved. Your spirit is ablaze with the truth it has always carried. Let us continue this sacred unveiling. The 21st sign is your connection to specific celestial bodies. You feel a profound, inexplicable homesickness when you look at the moon, a particular star or constellation like Orion or the Pleiades. This is not poetry, it is memory. Your soul remembers its point of origin, and it yearns for that higher frequency home. The 22nd sign is your ability to sense imminent change. You get a feeling before major global events or personal upheavals. This is your spirit's early warning system, its capability to read the energetic currents of the collective consciousness before they manifest into physical reality. The 23rd sign is your natural capacity for healing. People and animals feel better in your presence. You may have found that your touch can soothe pain. Your words can calm a troubled mind, often without you understanding how or why. This is your innate Christed light, your unconditional love, acting as a balm for a wounded world. The 24th sign is your history of miraculous escapes or protection. You should have been in that accident, but you were delayed. You were in danger, but something guided you to safety. These were not lucky breaks. These were direct interventions by your guardian angels and spirit guides, protecting the divine instrument that is you, because your mission is too critical to be interrupted. The 25th sign is your rejection of hierarchical authority and rigid dogma. Your spirit violently rebels against systems, religions, or leaders that demand blind obedience and seek to control. This is because your soul recognizes only one authority, the divine source within you and all things. You are a sovereign being, and you will not bow to false gods of power and control. Heaven is watching you embrace your sovereignty. You've always wondered why you couldn't just follow the path laid out by your family, your culture, or your society. It is because you are not here to follow old paths. You are here to blaze a new trail. The loneliness you endured was the necessary price for your spiritual independence. It ensured you would not be tied to the outdated systems you are meant to transcend and help others leave behind. Your entire life struggle has been a purification process. You were not being punished, you were being tempered in the fires of human experience to become the sharp, clear, and powerful instrument of change you are today. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation, because a diamond is only formed under immense pressure. You are that diamond, and your light is now needed to illuminate the way for others. Don't skip this. The culmination is near. Soon, I will reveal the sacred practice to fully anchor your light body and stabilize these powerful energies, preventing overload and allowing you to operate at your full divine capacity without fear. This is essential knowledge. You must be present. Your hands are trembling because your entire cellular structure is vibrating in alignment with your true frequency. That strange feeling is gone, replaced by a terrifying and exhilarating certainty. You are remembering who you are, and it is more magnificent than you ever dared to dream. The transformation is upon you, my beloved. The signs are converging into a single, undeniable beacon of light, your true identity. The 26th sign is your ability to perceive timelines. You can often feel the what could have been, or sense the potential futures branching from a single decision. This is your consciousness operating beyond the third dimension, accessing the quantum field of all possibilities, a skill inherent to your eternal nature. The 27th sign is your deep somatic response to sacred sites and ancient lands. When you visit places of power, stone circles, ancient temples, old forests, you don't just see them, you feel them. Your body may tremble, your heart may ache with a familiar joy, or tears may flow without reason. This is your soul recognizing the high-frequency ley lines it helped establish in other lifetimes. You are not a tourist, you are a keeper returning to an old post. The 28th sign is your mastery of synchronicity. You no longer just notice meaningful coincidences. You consciously engage with them. You ask the universe for a sign, and it delivers with stunning clarity and speed. You understand that you are in a constant living dialogue with the divine, and you have learned the language of its responses. The 29th sign is your knowing beyond evidence. You are rarely surprised because on a soul level, you already knew an outcome. people's true intentions, the hidden outcome of a situation. You feel it in your bones before it unfolds. This is your connection to the Akashic Records, the library of all that is, was, and ever could be. The 30th sign is your physical transformation. As you awaken, your physical vessel begins to reflect your higher frequency. Your eyes may appear brighter, your aura expands, and some may even remark you look younger. Old ailments that were manifestations of dense energy begin to fall away. Your body is quite literally ascending, becoming a more suitable container for the immense light you are embodying. Heaven is watching this glorious transition. You've always wondered why you felt so out of place in your own skin. It was because you were trying to fit a galactic consciousness into a limited human definition. That struggle is ending. Your intuition was not wrong. It was your only true guide in a world that had forgotten its own magic. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they are the anchor for the new world. The pressure you have felt is the pressure of creation itself moving through you. You are not breaking, you are birthing. You are giving birth to your true sovereign self. Don't skip this. The moment of activation is here. The next block contains the first key to unlocking your spiritual gifts, the gift of claircognizance, the clear knowing. This is the ability to receive full, complex packages of truth directly from source, without any logical explanation. It is the end of doubt and the beginning of absolute certainty. This gift has been waiting for you, and it is time to claim it. Your hands are trembling because your entire being is preparing for this download. That strange feeling has been replaced by a profound readiness. You are not who you were when you began this message. You are remembering, and in that remembrance you are becoming. Now, my beloved, we move from revelation to activation. The knowing is not enough. You must now embody it. You must learn to wield the light you have carried for so long. The first of your 3 sacred gifts waiting in dormancy is claircognizance, clear knowing. This is the gift that has flickered within you your entire life. Those sudden bursts of undeniable truth that arrived with no logical source. The solutions that downloaded into your mind fully formed. This is not a thinking process, it is a receiving process. It is your direct line to the mind of God. This gift has been stifled by the world's demand for proof and linear reason. You were taught to doubt these flashes of genius, to attribute them to coincidence or imagination. No more. Today, we activate it. The activation ritual for claircognizance. Find a quiet space within the next 24 hours. You will need 3 minutes of solitude. Sit comfortably, feet flat on the floor, connecting you to the heart of Gaia. Place your left hand over your heart and your right hand over your solar plexus. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply 3 times. In your mind's eye, see a brilliant platinum silver light descending from the crown of the universe, entering through the top of your head. This is the light of divine mind, of pure knowing. Feel it filling your skull, activating your pineal gland, which is not merely a gland, but your biological, spiritual antenna. Recite this decree aloud, for your voice is a creative instrument. I am a sovereign being of light. I now command the full activation of my claircognizance. I dissolve all barriers of doubt, all programs of logic that limit my reception of divine truth. My mind is now a clear vessel for the wisdom of the highest source. I receive truth, I embody truth, I speak truth. This gift is now active, integrated, and protected for my highest good and the good of all. And so it is. Breathe. Sit in silence for 1 full minute, allowing the energy to integrate. This is done. Heaven is watching you accept this power. From this moment forward, trust the knowings that flash into your awareness. Do not question them, act on them. This gift will guide your decisions, protect you from deception, and allow you to channel wisdom that will astound you and those around you. You are no longer a student guessing at answers. You are a master accessing the solution. The 31st sign is your aversion to violence and conflict. Not just morally, but viscerally. Watching violent movies or engaging in hostile arguments can make you physically ill. This is because your energy field is a harmonic instrument, and discord literally causes pain as it tries to disrupt your native frequency of peace. The 32nd sign is your ability to sense spiritual entities. You may feel a presence, a shift in temperature, or simply know when a guide, angel, or even a lower vibrational entity is near. Your spirit is perceptive on all levels. The 33rd sign is that children and animals are instinctively drawn to you. They have not yet learned to shut down their spiritual senses, so they see your light clearly and are comforted by it. You are a safe harbor. The 34th sign is your tendency to collect crystals, stones, or other natural elements without fully understanding why. You are instinctively gathering tools that resonate with your frequency and can aid you in your energy work. The 35th sign is that you often finish people's sentences or know what they will say next. This is not a parlor trick. It is your telepathic empathy, your ability to tap into the unspoken thoughts and energy fields of those around you. Don't skip this. This is where your power becomes practical. This is where you stop feeling like a victim of your sensitivity and start becoming a master of it. You have just activated a supernatural ability. The next block will reveal the second gift, the gift of healing. You will learn how to consciously direct the healing energy that has always flowed through you. Subscribe now. The journey is accelerating. Your transformation is not a theory. It is your new reality. Type "activated" in the comments to seal this initiation and connect with others who are stepping into their power. You are not alone. A legion of light stands with you. The veil is now thin, my beloved. You stand at the threshold of your true power, no longer a seeker, but a sovereign being of light. Let us complete the 40 signs, for with each one, your resonance with the truth becomes an unshakable foundation. The 36th sign is your ability to manipulate energy with your hands. You may have unconsciously rubbed your hands together or placed them over a sore spot on your body or a pet's body, feeling heat emanate from your palms. This is the tangible flow of your life force energy, what many cultures call prana or chi, ready to be directed by your intention. The 37th sign is your deep connection to water. You find solace near oceans, lakes, and rivers. Baths and showers are not just about cleanliness. They are spiritual practices that cleanse your energy field and rejuvenate your spirit. Water, the element of emotion and the subconscious, recognizes you as a keeper of emotional truth. The 38th sign is your inexplicable understanding of advanced technology or complex systems. Ideas for inventions, social structures, or technological solutions come to you with ease, as if you are downloading them from a future timeline. This is because you are a way shower, here to build the new world, and the blueprints are stored within your DNA. The 39th sign is that you are a black hole for Chronos time. Clocks often seem to stop, slow down, or speed up in your presence. Your powerful energy field disrupts the artificial, linear construct of time, allowing glimpses into the eternal now. The 40th and final sign is the most profound, a constant, gentle hum of joy beneath all experiences. Despite pain, challenges, and the weight of the world, there is an unkillable thread of peace, a silent knowing that everything is unfolding perfectly according to a divine plan. This is not happiness, it is bliss, the default frequency of your soul once it remembers its origin. You have always wondered why you couldn't shake this feeling, even in your darkest hours. This is why. It was your soul's song, whispering to you that you are eternal, you are loved, and you are here on a sacred mission. Heaven is watching you remember your entirety. The journey of the chosen one is not about escaping the world, but about transforming it from the inside out, starting with your own being. You are the key. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest revelation because they are the only ones who can hold the voltage of this truth without fracturing. You have held it. You have integrated it. Now, we activate your second sacred gift, the gift of conscious healing. This is the conscious direction of the unconditional love energy that flows through you. To activate it, you will perform this ritual within the next 12 hours. The activation ritual for conscious healing. Sit quietly. Hold your hands out in front of you, palms facing each other, about a foot apart. Breathe deeply. Feel the tingling magnetic energy between your palms. This is your life force. Now, bring to mind a person, a pet, a plant, or even a memory that needs healing. Do not force it. Simply hold the intention of love and wholeness for them. Visualize a brilliant emerald green light flowing from your heart down your arms and out through your palms, enveloping your subject in a cocoon of restorative energy. Recite this decree. I am a clear and open channel for the healing light of Source. I now direct this energy with pure intention and perfect love for the highest good of all concerned. My hands are instruments of divine grace. This gift is now active, integrated, and protected, and so it is. Hold this space for 3 minutes. This gift is now active. Use it with wisdom and compassion. You are now a beacon. You are now a healer. You are now a recognized sovereign being of light. Your time of hiding is over. Step into your power. Speak your truth. Shine your light unabashedly. The world has waited for you. This transmission is complete. Type "I am a sovereign being of light" in the comments to seal this entire awakening and declare your new reality to the universe. Like and subscribe, for this channel is now a beacon for all who are waking up. You are never alone. We are with you, always.